Are cults bad?
While I wouldn't necessarily disagree with the assertion that they are, I feel like a good deal of nuance is lost when painting cults with such a swift and absolute brush. While elements of cults can undeniably be harmful to vast swaths of people, especially in the case of doomsday ones, by themselves, these movements are made up of humans, and fundamental human concerns are what lie at the heart of every step in the process of forming a cult. So while yes, cults can be bad, they are also human, and the approach of outright labeling them evil can not only alienate people trying to get out of them, but also people trying to understand them. So let's try to understand them with what I think are more interesting questions. How do cults even begin? What drives people to join cults, and then stay with them for any amount of time? How do cults recruit new members? And finally, how do these cults tend to end? To answer these questions, I'll be using Heaven's Gate, Aum Shinrikyo, and Happy Science as examples.
How do cults begin?
In most cases, you'll find an individual, sometimes several, who through some mental illness, coercion, or chance encounter will become convinced of some otherworldly potential within themselves that must be preached to as many who will hear their message as possible. In the case of Heaven's Gate, you had two individuals meet at the right place and right time. Marshall Bo Applewhite and Bonnie T. Nettles. Marshall was a failed 30-year-old philosophy and music major who, after stepping down from 2 universities due to affairs with male students, being divorced from his wife, starting and closing a delicatessen within a year, he was in an emotionally vulnerable position when he first encountered Bonnie in 1972. Contrastly, Bonnie Nettles had a relatively positive life ahead of her by the time she met Marshall, being married, working as a nurse, and surrounded by family who cared about her. The interest in theosophy and astrology were honestly the only red flags as to the future she'd actually experience, which began when she met Marshall and told him that they were destined to be together, and had been companions in a previous life. It is this moment that sets into place the events which would lead to the death of 39 members in Rancho Santa Fe. These two became entranced with one another, and held an extremely close platonic relationship, and by all accounts were genuinely convinced of the doctrine they preached. So at least in their case, the goal from the outset wasn't to scam people out of money, or egomaniacally rule over a large group of people. It was simply to spread their own ideas about themselves. A sense of wasted potential is likely what drove both Marshall and Bonnie to start the group they did, and it's exactly this sense of wasted potential that the cult will tap into to recruit members at first. Heaven's Gate and the religious ideas they employed were a combination of Christianity, specifically cribbing the account of the 2 witnesses from the Book of Revelations, and popular science fiction tropes of the time, especially aliens and UFOs. If the group had started today, I don't think they would have amassed any following. But because of their birth in the 70s, during the time of Star Wars, Star Trek, Dune, space operas, new wave medicine, the birth of hippie spiritualism, etc., the ideas promoted by them were just a part of the culture at the time. They also used the fact that, while most of the country is Christian, not many have actually sat down and read the Bible to their advantage. They employed Christian symbolism and iconography to draw in those of faith, and masqueraded their doctrine as a secret most had yet to uncover about the good book. The existence of aliens at the time was, and still is, not that much of a leap in logic. The universe is endless, and so much of it is unexplored. It seems unlikely that the Earth is the only planet harboring life. Research group Localities discovered, surveying 21 countries, that 61% of people believe in some sort of intelligent life beyond Earth, 47 in alien civilizations. And this is data from 3 years ago. I imagine such percentages were higher in the 70s when the culture around such questions was more extraterrestrially minded. The group wasn't a suicide cult at first either, which was, in large part, what drew people to Heaven's Gate in the first place. They claimed that followers could enter the realm of heaven without dying, and that UFOs would take them into a realm where they would become beyond human, which was a phrase literally used by the posters and pamphlets they passed out early in their development. This sense of ascending personhood is what was so attractive to members at first, and tantamount to starting this 20-year spanning cult that ended in tragedy.
What drives people to join cults and then stay with them for any amount of time?
It's important not to presume mental illness on the part of members for even considering binding themselves to such an organization. Perhaps gullible, but as you'll see, even the most educated nuclear scientist can, with clouded judgment and the right placement, be coaxed into such a group. Western cults, excluding, say, Scientology, tend to incorporate elements of Judeo-Christian religions into their mythology. Doomsday and apocalyptic cults will tend to borrow passages from Revelations and Nostradamus in order to justify visions of Armageddon amongst their base. Contrastly, Eastern cults tend to borrow from Eastern religious practices, so your Shintoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and yes, some Christianity can be thrown in as well. Science fiction can play a large part in all matters of mythology. Asimov, Gibson, Dick, and Wells especially. A shared cultural understanding of symbols present in an ideology make that ideology easier to follow for whatever audience to which one would pander. In the case of Aum Shinrikyo, we'll see that assembling as many culturally significant symbols as possible is vital to attaining infamy amongst possible converts. Japan, after World War II, was in a prime place for a manipulative demagogue to swipe up an alienated populace. And while in the late 80s they had some time to repair the national conscience and the end of Shintoism, it was by no means over the tragedy of 40 years prior. Shintoism was the Japanese practice of praying for their emperor and the royal family as descendants of the sun god Amaterasu, and within the greater governmental system they were treated as such. After the Japanese surrender in 1945, Emperor Hirohito had to explicitly renounce his godhood on national radio, which left a rift in the religious conscience of many of those who subscribed to that belief. To fill this rift, an influx of new religious organizations arose during this time, and would continue to this day. Aum began in 1984 as a collection of mountain wizards. Their original name can loosely be translated to Aum Club of Mountain Wizards, changing it in 87, but since it's funny, that's what we're going with, who were headed by the half-blind scam artist guru Shoko Asahara. Born Chizuo Matsumoto, later changing his name, Shoko is easier to say. In truth, early into their history, their base consisted mostly of computer nerds and otaku. The mythology constructed by Shoko tended to draw in that sort of crowd. In combination to claiming he was the reincarnation in human form of the Hindu god of destruction Shiva, he also incorporated elements of the sci-fi anime series Space Battleship Yamato to describe the state of the world as an impending doom. He also based a large part of his mythology on Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. Early on, the base of Aum consisted of alienated salary workers and engineers who, during the boom economy of the Japanese 80s, were scammed out of money by Asahara. It's important to note that at first the cult began as a scam, but would later become a sincere investment on the part of Shoko. Later in its history, the group would be known colloquially as a religion for the elite. Recruitment consisted of luring people to participate in a spiritual reading, where they'd be asked if they experienced something supernatural, and no matter what it was, recruiters were instructed to nod and refer such individuals to Asahara. He would then take them on a spiritual journey by lacing the tea he offered with LSD, which over the course of 8 years, Shoko would continually ingest. It was due to this continual acid intake that the delusions Asahara crafted to scam people became very sincere very quickly. When members joined, he, like most cult leaders, instructed them to cut off ties to their family and anybody outside the organization. He did this to put ideological blinders on those of the group, so his control over them wouldn't weaken with time. The more contact with the outside world, the more doubts devotees tended to have about Aum. Because Shoko required members to pay exorbitant amounts of money in order to make it far in the group, the sunk cost fallacy likely manifested in the minds of the members, making it more difficult to justify leaving the longer one has been with the cult. A good deal of the philosophy promoted by Asahara required members to relinquish human desires and feelings in order to transcend personhood and be more in line with Shoko. The most pressing reason that members tended to stick around is that they weren't allowed to leave if they knew too much. This started in February of 1989 when an elderly recruit died during a waterboard-esque spiritual cleansing ritual, and in order to avoid police intervention, they burned the body to ash and scattered it in an unsuspecting field behind their outpost. After this, anybody who was insistent enough about leaving, Asahara would order them poa'd, which was a spiritual practice of beating someone to death with sticks for the good of both of your souls. So you had a cult leader who was not only a master of manipulation, but who also had no qualms about killing people and literally justifying their deaths with religious doctrine. It's kind of obvious why folks weren't quick to leave after knowing the consequences.
How do cults tend to recruit new members?
I've talked a great deal about how important familiar cultural signifiers are in recruitment for these idiosyncratic religious organizations, but now I want to talk about how the PR side of cults can effectively produce culture to propagandize to audiences far outside their immediate grasp. Happy Science, a controversial religious organization, also in Japan, when it was founded in the late 80s, correctly gauged the cultural tide of the coming decades, and created Happy Science Picture Studio, an animation studio, in 1997. Over the next 2 decades, they've made more than a dozen anime films, drawing in converts amongst anime fans worldwide, or just any spiritually curious people coerced into seeing a film. Anime distribution company 11 Arts has made it possible for the cult to screen their more recent films stateside and gain even more converts. Shinrikyo was no stranger to cultural production for public relations, also having created a few anime shorts back in their prime for propaganda purposes. To return to Aum's case, it can't be understated how they used national tragedy to their recruiting advantage, even if that national tragedy wasn't in Japan. When it came to the population makeup of Aum in 1994, 7,000 of the 40,000 members resided in Japan, and the reason for that is Asahara's opportunistic recruitment in post-Soviet Russia. Shoko incorporated elements of Christianity and Nostradamus into his religious vision, having read the Bible and deciding that he was the reincarnation of Jesus as well because the similarities were endless. Doing this was a smart move when it came to enlisting in Russia, as a majority were non-religious, but those who were tended to be Christian in some capacity. But most importantly, the destruction of Soviet tradition left vast swaths of the population ripe for being swept up by Asahara's shroud. Again, Aum began to pander to the educated class, and amongst their following they attracted a few ex-Soviet nuclear engineers, who had found difficulty finding employment after their employers collapsed along with the Berlin Wall. In Russia, they amassed 30,000 more followers, some of which with direct warfare experience.
So how do these cults tend to end?
To get Happy Science out of the way, they're still ongoing and still producing anime films. The worst they've endured so far is some controversy around their politics. Aum Shinrikyo is most famous for committing the largest terroristic act in Japanese history, when they attacked the Tokyo subway system in 1995. After this occurred, Asahara and members responsible for the attack were arrested and sentenced to death, which only just last year was carried out. After Shoko's arrest, membership has slowly declined over the years, and Aum has renamed themselves to Aleph, and are under the supervision of Japanese authorities. Heaven's Gate was on a crash course to tragedy when Body fell under the weather of cancer and eventually died, leaving a power vacuum and a solo marshal to lead a crumbling organization. The cult moved in a more apocalyptic direction, and eventually Marshall convinced 38 others to join him in consuming potassium cyanide in March of '97. Membership has become minuscule since then. So, what did we learn? Well, in a nutshell, familiar cultural signifiers, fragile living situation, and mental disorders can all be used in the service of an egomaniacal sociopath for the furthering of their own goals. The sources for this video were a podcast called Heaven's Gate, which is where I got most of my information about Heaven's Gate. When it comes to Aum Shinrikyo, I got it from the episodes that Last Podcast on the Left did about them. I absolutely could not stand the podcast. It was one of the most annoying and draining experiences of my life, but it did have good info, and I made sure to make note of that info. Pedantic Romantics video on Happy Science. I believe it's called The Cult Responsible for 20 plus years of Animation. That's where I got my Happy Science facts. And also a documentary called 0 Hour and their coverage of the Japanese subway sarin gas attack. So yeah, that's the research. Those are the sources.